We believe in another dimension, a spiritual side demand. We find a transcendent source for our claims to human freedom, our suggestion that inalienable rights come from one greater than ourselves. No one has done more to remind the world of the truth of human dignity, as well as the truth that peace and justice begins with each of us, than the special man who came to Portugal a few years ago after a terrible attempt on his life. He came here to Fatima, the site of your great religious shrine, to fulfill his special devotion to Mary, to plead for forgiveness and compassion among men, to pray for peace and the recognition of human dignity throughout the world.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. That was President Ronald Reagan before the Assembly of Portugal in Lisbon in 1985. Joining me to discuss the unique relationship between President Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II and his latest book, A Pope and a President, John Paul, Ronald Reagan, and the Extraordinary Untold Story of the 20th Century, is author, historian, and professor of political science at Grove City College, Paul Kengor. Paul, Ronald Reagan many times described John Paul II as his best friend.
Amazing statement.
Nancy Reagan had a similar comment about this relationship. Why? Where did this stem from?
I know, and I first heard about it from a group of Poles who met with Reagan in the spring of 1989. He was no longer president. They met him at his Century City office, and they came to him for campaign advice, of all things, because they were about to hold elections in Poland, and he said, listen to your conscience, because that's where the Holy Spirit speaks to you. Well, what was that? What was that? And then he turned and he pointed to a picture on his wall of John Paul II, and he said, he's my best friend. He said, yes, you know, I'm Protestant, and of course he's Catholic, but he's my best friend. And I heard that, and I mean, I was blown away by it. And then Nancy Reagan used some of the same language. She used the phrase closest friend, of all things. And to be sure, Raymond, I think there's a certain genial overstatement in that. They really weren't best friends in the way that two guys would call each other to talk about going fishing or going golfing. But I think, and this is key, that in this battle of the 20th century to defeat the scourge of atheistic Soviet communism, this call of a lifetime for Ronald Reagan, he saw no better friend, closer friend, no best friend more so than John Paul II.
In our intro to the segment, we played Ronald Reagan from 1985 before the Portugal Assembly.
Amazing.
Where he invokes Fatima, he talks about John Paul, he talks about the Fatima children. How does Fatima, this vision that happened over 6 months in 1917, intersect and weave into the lives of these two men, John Paul II and Ronald Reagan?
Yeah, I opened the book with the shooting of the Holy Father in St. Peter's Square and the feast day of Our Lady of Fatima, May 13th, 1981. And then I bounced back to May 13th, 1917 and start the narrative there. But I was shocked. I had no idea that Reagan had any of this interest in Fatima. It's one of the things that I learned over the time. This book, I've been working on it for almost 20 years, but I kept getting pulled in, right? Should I do it? Should I not do it? And then I would learn things like this. I was told by, among other people, Frank Shakespeare, the second ambassador to the Vatican, he told me about briefing Reagan on Fatima, one-on-one, just the two of them alone, flying in a small plane from the G7 in northern Italy down to Rome. This was June 1987. And then briefing him in the car on Fatima. I said, what did Reagan say? He said Reagan was really engaged, intensely interested. I asked other people about it. Tony Dolan, the Reagan speechwriter, a devout Catholic, and he wrote the Evil Empire speech, among others. He said, oh, yeah. He said, you know, Reagan talked about Fatima in Portugal. I said, he did? When was that? I mean, the author of God and Ronald Reagan, right? I didn't know that. I said, when? And so I finally just typed in the Reagan presidential public papers, the word Fatima, which I never thought to do before. Why would I type in Fatima? And bam, it popped up. May 9th, 1985, Reagan to the government of Fatima, the Portuguese Assembly, the president of the country is there. He mentioned Mary, Fatima, John Paul II, the shrine, the shepherd children. He said that in the prayers of those shepherd children was more power than in all the armies and statesmen of the world.
And how does that guide this relationship? These two men, assassination attempts within 6 weeks of each other.
Everybody forgets that.
And they saw this real prophetic, providential hand in their lives. What brings them together, and how does Fatima hold them there?
Well, Reagan wanted to meet with the Holy Father as soon as he saw footage of his trip to Poland in June 1979. He wasn't president yet. But once he came in January 1981, he wanted to get together. And yeah, everybody remembers that they were shot, but they forget that they were shot only 6 weeks apart.
Right.
So Reagan, March 30th, 81, the Holy Father, May 13th, 1981. And then they finally got together at the Vatican, June 7th, 1982. And you had this Protestant president and this Pope, and they said to one another that they believed, because they should have died. I mean, they should have bled to death. People have no idea. The Holy Father got 6 pints of blood transfused in him. He got last rites given to him by Father
less than an inch from the heart.
Less than an inch from the main abdominal artery. And with Reagan, less than an inch centimeters to the main heart artery as well. Reagan got 8 to 9 pints. So they said to one another that they believed God had spared their life for a special purpose, which was to defeat Soviet communism. And I asked Frank Shakespeare and other people, do you think they talked about Fatima at that meeting in June 1981? And Frank said, I don't know for sure. I don't have the document because the Vatican records on this are sealed until the year 2057.
Yeah, you have a little time
to
wait.
I'll be 90, maybe.
That's okay. You'll still be able to confirm
if I can make it. But he said, I don't have proof that they did, but I can't imagine that they didn't talk about Fatima.
What is the lesson for leaders today? Because John Paul mounted a spiritual crusade. He was also sharing information with Bill Casey, who was the CIA director. They were leaking all kinds of information. Bill Casey, the subject of your biography, Judge Clark, the two of them really were instrumental in forging and binding this relationship between Reagan and John Paul.
They were, and Pio Laghi as well, the Apostolic Nuncio. If there was a troika, it was really Casey, Clark, and Laghi. And Bill Clark, who you interviewed, that was a wonderful interview, wonderful show. Clark loved that. And he would drop over to Laghi's residence weekly, sometimes more. And no notes. They had an absolute rule of no notes. Everything, he would come back and brief Reagan directly on what they said. But I think the lesson for it, Raymond, is that if you get a president and a pope who, to use Frank Shakespeare's words, kindred spirits, kindred souls, really thought alike, even religiously thought alike, prayed together. Those two prayed together. If you can get two men of one mind and one purpose, facing a great international threat with a unity of vision on how to respond, you could literally change history and change the world.
Now, it is clear that Donald Trump is ripping a page from the Ronald Reagan playbook here, trying to engage not only the Pope, but other religious leaders in this new initiative to stamp out Islamic terror from the face of the earth. How successful, in your estimation, has he been, and will he be with the current Pope?
Well, I think it's fascinating. It's about 35 years to the day that Reagan, and 35 years of the week that Reagan and John Paul II met at the Vatican for the first time. Francis has to really appreciate that this president, for his first foreign trip abroad, which always has important symbolic meaning, would pick the Vatican. Picked the Vatican. He got to the Vatican as president earlier than Reagan did as president because of the shootings, of course, derailed what Reagan wanted to do. But he went to Saudi Arabia, the home of Mecca. He went to Jerusalem, the Holy Land, and then he went to the Vatican, of all things. So these two didn't go in with the same kindred spirit, agreement on things, the same spiritual unity, and with having survived assassination attempts like Reagan and John Paul II did. But I think it's interesting that they really have strived to try to find commonalities and areas of agreement where they think they can work together.
And just to give the audience a little sense of John Paul, this is from the time of that meeting between the Pope and the President in Miami. This is John Paul II. Watch this from 1987. Watch.
I come to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ to all those who freely choose to listen to me, to tell again the story of God's love in the world, to spell out once more the message of human dignity with its inalienable human rights and its inevitable human duties.
Your reaction listening to that?
Yeah, it's great. I mean, he and Ronald Reagan here too. Reagan said every human being is, well, here to borrow the language of John Paul II, precious and unrepeatable. Reagan said, here he was quoting Father Theodore Hesburgh of Notre Dame. Reagan said, every person is a res sacra, a sacred reality. And because of that, every human being from conception, from womb to the tomb, is sacred and eternal and special and deserves to be protected.
While you bring that up, in the book you reveal something that I don't know how I missed this. Is this in George Weigel's book about that John Paul's mother, Karol Wojtyła's mother, was encouraged to have an abortion? I don't know why I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't know if Weigel reported it, but it's been reported by a couple Italian sources. I think maybe Vatican, inside the Vatican, I think, might have reported it. But yeah, that she'd had very problematic pregnancies. In fact, she died when he was only 8 years old. And another interesting parallel, Raymond, Ronald Reagan's mother almost died when he was 8 years old. And if she had died, I can't imagine him becoming president. She almost died from the influenza epidemic of 1919. After World War I. And then yet another parallel, their two fathers died within just weeks of each other in the spring of 1941. So there's so many parallels between the two of these. John Paul II would have appreciated Reagan's Catholic connections. He had a Catholic father, a Catholic brother who was a daily communicant. And I don't think people know this. Jane Wyman, Ronald Reagan's ex-wife, not only converted to the Catholic Church in 1954, she died a third-order Dominican nun.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Jane Wyman was buried in the habit. And she was so devout that when she was on Falcon Crest in the 1980s, she had drawn into her contract that a priest be on the set with her every day to give her communion.
Wow.
So Ronald Reagan, to say he was surrounded by Catholics, he really was.
Yeah, Chan, call my priest in. It was a great show, Falcon Crest. Before I let you go, Bill Casey, the then CIA chief, did an investigation into the assassination of John Paul II. He discovered what?
He did, and this is what really told me I had to do the book when I first learned this. The institutional CIA was just terrible. They were not investigating this. The Italians were investigating the shooting of the Holy Father. Institutional CIA was not. Casey got so fed up that he finally had a super secret, really tight internal investigation. I was told it was led by two young women, one in her late 20s, early 30s, one in probably her early 40s. And they concluded in a report that still has not been released to this day.
Wow.
Right? But I know what it says. I haven't seen the report, but I know what it says. They concluded April, May 1985 that the Soviets ordered the hit on the Pope. And specifically, it was the Soviet GRU military intelligence, and they did it with the knowledge, the go-ahead, and the approval of Yuri Andropov at the KGB. And then in turn, Casey went and briefed Reagan on it, and I was even told what the briefing was about, what they said. It's still classified. It's one of the only pages in the Reagan diary that hasn't been cleared for declassification. And I'm almost certain, Raymond, that when they met, because it's the only time that the two of them met one-on-one in that April-May time frame, I think it was May 16th, 1985. We've got the exact date, exact time, and everything.
Amazing.
That information is still sitting in Langley in Washington somewhere, and it needs to be declassified.
Okay, you've made your case.
Thank you.
Paul Kengor, thank you so much for being
Absolutely.
here. A Pope and a President, John Paul Ronald Reagan in the Extraordinary Untold Story of the 20th Century by Paul Kengor is available online and at bookstores everywhere.